I study nocturnal soundscapes in national parks. One station has captured 14 instances of total silence, followed by something that sounds like singing. I've been doing this work for 11 years, which is long enough to know what every national park sounds like at 2 in the morning, and short enough that I haven't gotten bored of it. Acoustic ecology. That's the formal name. What it actually means is that I place recording equipment in wilderness areas, and then I listen to what the land does when it thinks nobody's paying attention. The National Park Service has funded long-duration monitoring programs since the late 90s, and I came into it sideways. Through a master's in environmental science and a part-time gig calibrating equipment for a professor at Colorado State who couldn't be bothered to do his own fieldwork. He retired. I stayed. The NPS absorbed me into their Natural Sounds and Night Skies division, which is a real department with a real office in Fort Collins. And for the better part of a decade, I've been rotating between sites, servicing stations, pulling data, and writing the kind of reports that 3 people read and nobody acts on. I want to be clear about what the work is, because it matters for what I'm about to describe. We're not recording birdsong. We capture birdsong, incidentally. But what we're measuring is the baseline acoustic environment, the full sound pressure level of a given area over time. Across all frequencies, you set a station, which is basically a calibrated microphone, in a weatherproof housing bolted to a post. You pair it with a data logger and a solar panel, and you leave it. It records continuously. Back in the lab, you process weeks or months of audio into spectrograms, which are visual representations of sound across time and frequency. A spectrogram of a healthy wilderness area looks like a painting. You can see the dawn chorus as a bright band in the upper frequencies. You can see wind as a low smear. You can see a commercial aircraft transit as a clean diagonal line cutting across everything. Rain is a white wall. Silence, true silence, is a gap of vertical stripe of nothing, which in practice almost never happens because there is always thermal noise, insect activity, distant water, something. The microphones we use are sensitive enough to pick up the thermal expansion of rock faces at dawn. There is always something. I need you to hold that thought. The station I want to talk about is in a park I'm not going to name, not because I'm protecting anything dramatic, but because the monitoring data is still under review. And I have professional obligations that I take seriously even when I'm not sure the institution holding me to them deserves that seriousness. What I'll tell you is that it's in the desert Southwest. It's large. It has extensive canyon systems. And the acoustic monitoring station in question, which I'll call Station 27, because that's close enough to its real designation, sits on a mesa shelf about 600 feet above a dry wash, facing southeast into a canyon that opens toward a larger drainage. It's not remote by backcountry standards. There's a maintained trail that passes within a quarter mile. But the trail doesn't go to the station, and nobody visits it except the tech who services it twice a year. For the 3 years before I took over the route, that tech was a woman named Erin Lacroix. I met Erin in Fort Collins in March of last year. I'd been reassigned to cover the Southwest Circuit after the previous technician, a guy named Dan Aldana, took a position with the Forest Service. Erin had handled several of the same stations before Dan and was training me on the route, not because I didn't know how to service equipment, but because every circuit has its own logistics, its own access points, its own quirks. Which roads wash out, where you can and can't camp. Which stations have battery problems in winter. That kind of institutional knowledge that lives in one person's head and dies when they leave. Erin was in her mid-40s, compact, weathered in the way that people get when they've spent 2 decades doing seasonal fieldwork in the arid West. She was not warm, exactly. She was precise. She gave information the way a good mechanic gives information, no wasted words, no narrative. just the sequence of things you need to know, in the order you need to know them. She had a way of watching you while you worked that wasn't supervisory so much as diagnostic. Like she was checking whether you'd internalized what she'd told you, or whether she'd need to tell you again. We spent 2 days in the office going over maps and data logs, and then she drove with me for the first circuit, which took 9 days. Most of it was uneventful. She'd ride in the passenger seat working on her own laptop, occasionally telling me to take a specific fork or stop before a wash crossing to check depth. At each station, she'd walk the perimeter while I did the swap, pull the full SD card, insert a blank, check cable connections, test the solar panel output, note any physical damage. She didn't hover. At one station, she pointed out where pack rats had chewed through a cable sleeve 2 winters back and showed me the type of conduit wrap they'd started using since. It was at station 27 that her behavior changed. Not dramatically. Erin wasn't a dramatic person, but I noticed it. We'd hiked in from the trailhead, which was about a 40-minute walk across slick rock and sand to the mesa shelf where the station sat. It was late afternoon, clear, maybe 65 degrees. The kind of light that makes sandstone look like it's generating its own warmth. The station was in good shape, clean panel, solid mount, no rodent damage. I started the swap, and Erin did her usual walk, except this time she came back faster and stood closer to me while I worked. Not uncomfortably close. Just present, in a way she hadn't been at the other sites. When I finished and stood up, she said, "Pull the last card and run it when we get back." I told her that was standard, that I always archived the full card before formatting. She said, "No, I mean listen to it. Don't just process it. Put headphones on and listen." I asked her what I'd be listening for. She didn't answer that directly. What she said was, "Station 27 has some data artifacts that Dan flagged. 14 events over the last 3 years. They show up as total signal dropout, followed by a tonal element. They're in the log as equipment anomalies, and that's probably what they are. But I want you to hear them yourself because you're going to be the one writing the service notes. And if the pattern continues, you should know what it sounds like so you can characterize it accurately." That was a perfectly reasonable thing to say. Equipment anomalies happen. Microphones develop faults. Moisture gets into housings. Electrical interference from geological sources, piezoelectric effects, in quartz-bearing rock, for instance, can produce tonal artifacts. I'd seen all of those in spectrograms before. None of them had ever required someone to stand next to me and tell me to listen with headphones. I said sure, I'd listen. Then she said something else. She said, "When you're up here servicing this one, do it during the day and don't stay past sunset. That's not a safety rule. It's a preference. Dan felt the same way, and so do I." I want to be fair to Erin. She was not being mysterious. She was being careful with language in the way that a scientist is careful. She wasn't going to claim something she couldn't support. She told me the data was anomalous. She told me to listen. She told me she preferred to service the station during daylight. All of those things were factually accurate and professionally appropriate. And if I'd followed all of them exactly, I probably wouldn't be telling you any of this. Back in Fort Collins, I pulled the data from Station 27's card and began processing. 3 months of continuous audio, which at our sample rate produces a substantial volume of files. I ran the spectrogram first because that's how you find events. You look for visual anomalies in the frequency time display, and then you go listen to those specific segments. The 13 stations on my circuit produce the normal range of data. Aircraft overflights, which we track for noise pollution reports, thunderstorm events, coyote choruses, which are always beautiful on a spectrogram. They look like northern lights. Occasional vehicle noise from distant roads. All normal. Station 27 spectrogram had 14 gaps. I need to describe what a gap looks like, because the word undersells it. In a normal recording, even in the quietest desert conditions at 3 in the morning, the spectrogram shows activity, low-frequency wind noise, thermal background, insect stridulation in warmer months, distant coyotes, the faint subaudible hum that we think is geological flexion in the rock strata, microseismic activity, deep groundwater movement. There is always a texture. The spectrogram is never blank. These 14 events were blank, not low blank. Across all frequencies, from the infrasonic range up through the limit of the microphone sensitivity, the signal dropped to the noise floor of the equipment itself, which means the microphone was functioning. It was recording its own electronic noise, but the environment was producing nothing. No wind, no insects, no thermal activity, no geological hum. Nothing. Each dropout lasted between 4 and 7 minutes. All 14 occurred between 1 a.m. and 4 a.m. 12 were in autumn and winter. 2 were in late spring. None were in summer. They were irregularly spaced, sometimes weeks apart, sometimes months. And at the end of each dropout, in the seconds before normal ambient sound resumed, there was a tonal element. I put my headphones on, the way Aaron told me to, and I listened. The silence was the first thing. You don't understand how unnatural total silence is in a natural environment until you hear it through a sensitive microphone. It's not peaceful. It's not restful. It's the acoustic equivalent of a blank wall where a window should be. Your brain keeps reaching for the sounds it expects, the tiny scratchings, the air movement, the deep pulse of the earth, and finding nothing. It is the sound of an environment that has stopped. After 4 minutes and 12 seconds of that, something else began. I've spent weeks trying to describe this accurately, and I'm going to do my best, but I want to acknowledge up front that language isn't adequate for it. It was tonal, meaning it had pitch. It had a fundamental frequency with overtones. It wasn't noise or static. It was in a range roughly equivalent to a human voice, somewhere between 200 and 600 hertz, with harmonics extending higher. It lasted between 15 and 40 seconds, depending on the event. And the best word for what it sounded like, the honest, unscientific, first impression word, is singing. Not singing the way a human sings, not a melody, not words. More like the sustained, shaped vocalization you might hear from a very distant choir, warming up in a cathedral, individual tones, braiding and separating, rising and falling in intervals that almost suggested structure, but never quite resolved into a pattern you could predict. There was something about it that was deeply, almost physically, pleasant to listen to. It produced a sensation in my chest that I can only compare to the feeling you get when someone you love says your name from another room. A warmth, a pull. I listened to all 14 instances that afternoon. Then I listened to them again. Then I isolated the tonal segments, normalized the levels, and listened to just those, one after another. Erin called me that evening. She asked if I'd listened. I said yes. She asked me what I thought. I told her I had no explanation for the silence events, and that the tonal element was unlike anything in my experience, but was probably geological or atmospheric in origin. She said, probably. And then she said, Dan listened to them a lot, more than was useful. I think it's worth hearing them a few times for characterization purposes, and after that, just log them and move on. I said I understood. I want to tell you that I followed her advice. I want to tell you that I treated Station 27 as one more data point in a long and largely unremarkable career of listening to wild places in the dark. But what I actually did, over the following weeks, was return to those 14 audio files again and again. And each time I listened, the tonal segments became more detailed to my ear. I began hearing or believing I heard subtle variations between events. The intervals between tones were different each time. The harmonic structure shifted. In one recording from a November event, there was a moment where two tonal lines converged on the same pitch and held it. And the resonance produced was so physically affecting that I took my headphones off and sat in my office with my hands flat on the desk for several minutes, breathing. I am a careful person. I have spent my career in empirical observation. But I recognized, sitting there, that I was behaving the way people behave when they've found something that matters to them more than it should, and that Aaron's advice had not been casual. In September, I drove the circuit again. 9 days, 13 stations. I saved Station 27 for the last day, and I arrived at the trailhead at 10 a.m. with the sun already high and hot. I did the hike in 35 minutes, serviced the equipment, pulled the card. Everything nominal. The canyon below was quiet and golden and smelled like warm juniper. I stood at the edge of the mesa shelf and looked out over the drainage and thought about what it would sound like here at 2 a.m. when the microphone recorded nothing. I left before noon. Back in Fort Collins, I processed the card. 3 more silence events had occurred since my last pull. That made 17 total. Same profile complete signal dropout, same time window, same duration range, tonal element at the end. Except the tonal elements were longer. The most recent one, from late August, lasted 53 seconds. This is where I need to tell you about Naya. Naya Rojas Kim was a graduate student at the University of Arizona, working on a dissertation about anthropogenic noise impacts on bat echolocation behavior in arid canyon systems. She had contacted our office through the standard research partnership channels, requesting access to acoustic monitoring data from several Southwest stations, including Station 27. Her proposal was solid. She wanted long-duration ambient recordings to correlate with her own ultrasonic bat monitoring data. I was assigned as her field liaison, which meant I'd be coordinating her access to sites and helping her install supplementary equipment at 3 stations, including 27. Naya arrived in early October. She was 27, originally from Tucson, and she had the particular energy of a doctoral candidate who is close enough to see the end of the degree, but not so close that she's exhausted by it. She was sharp, organized, meticulous about her equipment, and relentlessly curious in a way that I remembered being and had gradually trained out of myself through years of institutional work. She asked questions constantly about the stations, the data, the processing methods, the history of the monitoring program. Good questions. The kind that showed she'd already done her reading and was now probing the gaps between what was published and what was known. We spent 2 days installing her supplementary equipment at the first 2 stations, which went smoothly. On the 3rd day, we drove to the trailhead for Station 27. It was mid-morning, clear, a light wind from the west. I carried the heavier pack because I knew the trail and could move faster with weight. Naya carried her own bat detection equipment, which was lighter but more delicate. On the hike in, she asked about the station's data history, and I gave her the standard summary: years of operation, seasonal noise profiles, notable acoustic events. I did not mention the silence events or the tonal element. I thought about it. I thought about it on the drive to the trailhead and on the hike in, and while we stood on the mesa shelf, looking out over that gorgeous, sun-blasted canyon. And I decided not to mention it because I told myself it wasn't relevant to her research. Her work was about bat echolocation, which operates in the ultrasonic range, well above the frequencies of the tonal element. The silence events, if they were equipment anomalies, wouldn't affect her supplementary recordings because she was using her own independent equipment. There was no scientific reason to tell her. That was the reason I gave myself. The actual reason, which I can admit now, was that I didn't want her to hear the recordings. The feeling that produced that reluctance was not protective, not exactly. It was closer to the way you feel when someone reaches for a book on your nightstand that you're in the middle of and haven't finished yet, private, territorial even, which is not a rational or professional way to feel about an acoustic anomaly in a public data set, and I knew that, and I chose not to examine it too carefully. We installed her equipment. She was efficient. She had clearly done installations like this many times. She mounted her ultrasonic detector on a separate post about 15 meters from the main station, oriented it toward the canyon mouth, wired it to her own logger, and calibrated it in under an hour. While she worked, I serviced Station 27's main equipment. Normal swap, normal checks. When I pulled the card, I put it in my vest pocket rather than my pack, which was not my usual practice, but which I did without thinking about it. Naya wanted to spend more time at the site. She wanted to walk the canyon rim, photograph the terrain, take GPS points for her habitat mapping. She asked if I minded staying an extra hour or two. I said that was fine. The sun was still high. We had plenty of daylight. We walked the rim together. She pointed out features relevant to her work rock shelters that might serve as roost sites. Cliff faces with appropriate crevice density, vegetation corridors that bats would use for navigation. I pointed out features relevant to mine sight lines to the main station, potential sources of interference, the direction of the nearest road. It was pleasant. It was professional. The landscape was beautiful, and the company was good. And for a while, I forgot about the recordings entirely. At some point, standing on an outcrop overlooking the main drainage, Naya asked me if I'd ever spent a night out here. I told her I hadn't. I told her I serviced the station during the day. She said she wanted to do an overnight recording session at some point during the bat activity season, which was winding down but hadn't ended yet. October nights were still warm enough for bat activity in the canyons. She said she'd done solo overnights at remote field sites before and was comfortable with it, but that her university required a safety partner for any overnight backcountry work. She asked if I'd be willing to be that partner. I should have said no. I had Aaron's advice. I had my own instinct, which was clear and specific, and which I had been following without difficulty for months. Do not be at Station 27 after dark. That was not a rule anyone had written down. It was not a policy. It was the inherited preference of the two people who had worked this circuit before me. And inherited preferences in fieldwork exist for reasons that are usually better than the explanations given for them. But Naya had a legitimate research need. Her dissertation depended on field recordings from active bat sites during peak nocturnal activity periods. Station 27 sat in prime habitat. Her university required a safety partner, and I was the assigned liaison. Saying no would have required me to give a reason, and the only honest reason was that a retired colleague had told me she preferred not to be here after sunset, and that the station's audio data contained unexplained silence events that made me feel something I couldn't articulate. So I said yes. We scheduled the overnight for October 18th. Naya submitted her field plan to her university, and I submitted mine to the park. Both were approved. On the 17th, we drove to the trailhead, cached water, and reviewed the plan. Hike in the afternoon of the 18th. Set up camp near the station. Run her bat detectors from dusk through dawn. Hike out the morning of the 19th. Simple, standard, unremarkable. October 18th was clear and warm. High of 72, winds calm by late afternoon. We hiked in at 3 p.m., set up 2 tents on flat ground about 40 meters from the station, and Naya activated her bat detection array at sunset. The main acoustic station was running as always, recording continuously. We ate a cold dinner. Neither of us wanted to introduce food smells that might alter animal behavior near the detectors, and settled into the routine of a field overnight, which is mostly sitting quietly and waiting. The desert at night is not quiet. I want to emphasize that because it matters. After sunset, the canyon came alive with sound. Insects, a continuous, dense, layered chorus of crickets and katydids that built through the first hour of darkness into a wall of high-frequency sound. Owls, at least 2 great horned owls, calling across the drainage, their low hoots carrying for miles. Coyotes, starting around 9 p.m., first a single animal to the north, and then a group response from the south side of the canyon that went on for 10 minutes. And was so elaborate and musical that Naya whispered, "God, that's beautiful." And I agreed. Bats were active. We could hear the faint ticking of echolocation on Naya's equipment. And she was getting good data, checking her logger every hour with a red headlamp. The canyon was alive. The microphone was recording a rich, dense, healthy nocturnal soundscape. I began to feel foolish about my anxiety. This was a functional ecosystem, doing what functional ecosystems do. And the idea that there was something wrong here began to seem like the product of too many hours alone, with headphones and an overactive pattern recognition system. At midnight, Naya said she was going to sleep for a few hours and asked me to monitor the equipment until 3 a.m. when she'd take over for the pre-dawn shift. I agreed. She went to her tent. I sat in my camp chair near the station, wearing a fleece against the cooling air, and listened. The soundscape held. Insects, wind, the occasional owl, a kangaroo rat drumming somewhere on the mesa, that rapid-fire foot percussion they use for territory marking, which on a spectrogram looks like a tiny jackhammer. Normal, alive, good. At 1:47 a.m., it stopped. I need to be precise about this because precision is the only thing I have. I was sitting in my chair, facing the canyon. I was not wearing headphones. I was listening with my own ears to the ambient sound of a desert night. And at 1:47, I know the time because I checked my watch immediately, reflexively, the way you do when the data starts. The sound stopped. Not faded, not diminished, stopped. The insect chorus, which had been continuous and dense for 6 hours, ceased in what felt like a single moment. The wind, which had been a faint, steady presence from the west, was gone. The distant coyotes, the owls, the kangaroo rat, gone. The entire acoustic environment of a living canyon system dropped to nothing. I have sat in anechoic chambers. I have worn laboratory-grade hearing protection in soundproof rooms. Neither of those experiences prepared me for what total silence sounds like outdoors, at night, in a place that was screaming with life 30 seconds earlier. An anechoic chamber is designed to be silent. You expect it. Your brain adjusts. This was silence imposed on a space that should not have been silent, and my body knew the difference before my mind caught up. My heart rate spiked. My hands gripped the armrests of my camp chair. I became aware of the sound of my own blood in my ears, my own breathing, the faint creak of the chair's fabric under my shifting weight. Those sounds were enormous in the absence of everything else. They were the only sounds in the world. I sat there. I did not move. I did not wake Naya. I don't know why I didn't wake her. That question has occurred to me many times since, And the honest answer is that the silence felt like something I was not supposed to interrupt. That's not rational, I know that. But in the moment, the idea of making a sound of speaking, of getting up, of unzipping her tent, felt like it would be a violation of something. An intrusion into a space that had been cleared for a purpose. I checked my watch at intervals. 1:49, 1:51, 1:52. The silence held. It was absolute. I realized I couldn't hear Naya's breathing from her tent, which was only 12 meters away. I couldn't hear the nylon of her sleeping bag shifting. I couldn't hear the station's electronics, which normally produce a faint hum. Nothing. At 1:54, the tonal element began. Through headphones, in a processed recording, the sound had been beautiful and strange and affecting. Live, in the open air, in the dark, with no competing sound, was something else entirely. It came from the canyon. Not from a specific point, not from the left or right, not from close or far. It came from the canyon the way light comes from the sky at dusk, directionless and total. It was in the air. It was in the rock under my feet. I could feel it in my sternum, in my teeth. It was lower than the recordings had suggested, with a physical weight to it, a subsonic pressure that I felt in my chest before I heard it with my ears. And then the upper harmonics bloomed. And it was exactly what I'd heard in the recordings, except that it was real and present and filling the space around me with a density that made the air itself for this feel different. I am going to tell you what it did to me, and I need you to understand that I'm being clinical about this, because clinical is the only way I can say it. It felt good. It felt like being held. It felt like the warmth that I had noticed in the recordings, except that in the recordings, it had been a suggestion, and now it was an environment. The tonal element, the singing, I'll call it what it is, was producing a physical and emotional response in my body that I could not override with rational thought. My grip on the chair loosened. My heart rate, which had spiked during the silence, slowed. My breathing deepened. I felt a profound, encompassing calm. And at the center of that calm was an impulse to stand up and walk toward the sound. I did not stand up. I want to be clear about that. But I want to be equally clear that the reason I didn't stand up was not willpower or good judgment. The reason I didn't stand up was that Aaron Lacroix's voice was in my head saying, "Don't stay past sunset." And the presence of that voice, mundane, practical, unafraid, was enough to introduce a hesitation. And in that hesitation, I was able to grip the armrests again. And having gripped them, I was able to decide to keep gripping them. The singing lasted, I checked, 1 minute and 43 seconds. Then it faded, not abruptly, but in a diminishing curve, the lower frequencies persisting longer than the upper ones, which is consistent with natural acoustic propagation in a canyon environment, and also consistent with something moving away. And then, within seconds of the sound ending, the insects resumed. The wind came back. An owl called. The canyon was alive again, as if someone had pressed play on a paused recording. I sat in my chair until 3 a.m. The soundscape remained normal. At 3, I woke Naya for her shift. She crawled out of her tent, red headlamp on, yawning, and asked if everything had been quiet. I said yes. She checked her bat detectors, scrolled through data on her logger, and said she was getting excellent recordings and that the species diversity was even better than she'd hoped. I went to my tent. I did not sleep. I lay in my sleeping bag and stared at the tent ceiling and listened to the completely ordinary sounds of a desert night and tried to organize what had happened into categories that I could work with. At dawn, we packed up, hiked out, and drove back. In the car, Naya talked about her data, about the species she'd identified from the overnight recordings, about the next steps for her dissertation. She was happy. She was doing good work. I drove and responded at appropriate intervals, and thought about the SD card in the main station, which now contained a live, in-situ recording of what I had heard, and about whether, when I pulled it and processed it, the data would confirm what I had experienced or reveal that the silence and the singing had been something my own mind produced. I processed the card 2 days later. The data was there. Complete signal dropout at 1:47 a.m., lasting 7 minutes and 8 seconds, followed by a tonal element of 1 minute 43 seconds. The spectrogram showed exactly what the previous 17 events had shown, a total gap followed by a structured tonal signature, except that this one was louder, longer, and the harmonic structure was more complex. When I overlaid the spectrogram of this event with the first one from 3 years earlier, the difference was like comparing a sketch to a painting. The same essential form, but richer, more developed, more detailed, more, and I am choosing this word deliberately, articulate. I did something I shouldn't have done. I checked Naya's bat detector data for the same time window. Her equipment operated in the ultrasonic range. It wasn't designed to capture the frequencies of the tonal element. But her detector had a broadband mode for calibration purposes, and she'd left it active overnight. In that broadband channel, at 1:47 a.m., there was the same dropout. And in the tonal element, at the upper edge of Naya's equipment sensitivity, there were harmonics that my station's microphone hadn't captured, overtones extending up into a range that overlapped with bat echolocation frequencies. The singing was not limited to the range I could hear. It extended beyond it. It was broader than our equipment could measure from any single instrument. I reported the event in my service notes as an equipment anomaly, consistent with previous entries. I flagged it for further investigation. I recommended a supplementary low-frequency sensor be installed at Station 27 to better characterize the tonal events. The recommendation went into a queue, and, as of when I'm telling you this, has not been acted on. In November, Naya asked to schedule a second overnight at Station 27. She said her first data set had been excellent, but that she needed replication, a second night of recordings from the same site under comparable conditions to strengthen her analysis. This is standard scientific practice. I could not argue with it methodologically. I told her I wasn't available for the dates she proposed. This was true. I had a service run at 2 other stations that week. She asked about the following week. I suggested a different station. She said Station 27's bat diversity was significantly higher than the alternatives, and that her data justified returning to the same site. She was right. I suggested she find a different safety partner. She said I was the only NPS liaison approved for overnight work at that site, and that going through the approval process for someone else would take weeks she didn't have. I want you to understand the position I was in. I had no evidence of danger. I had an acoustic anomaly that was unexplained but not threatening. I had a personal experience that was unsettling but not harmful. I had sat through the event. I was fine. Nothing had happened to me. I had a retired colleague's preference for daytime visits, which is not a warning. I had my own discomfort, which is not data. Against all of that, I had a graduate student with a legitimate research need, a university-approved field plan, and a right to access the site. So I agreed. November 14th. The hike in was colder this time. High 40s, dropping fast after sunset. We set up in the same spot. Naya activated her equipment. We ate. We settled in. The soundscape was thinner in November, fewer insects, the cold suppressing much of the invertebrate chorus, but still present. Owls, coyotes, the low-frequency geological murmur that I now listened for with a new attentiveness. I told Naya that I'd take the full night shift. I said I'd slept well and wasn't tired, and that she should get a full night's rest so she'd be fresh for the hike out. She argued briefly she took the partnership seriously and didn't want me to bear the whole burden, but I insisted, and she agreed. By 11 p.m., she was asleep. I sat in my chair. I had brought a notebook this time, and I wrote down the ambient sounds I could identify at 30-minute intervals. Owl, west-northwest. Wind, steady. 5 to 8 miles per hour estimate. Distant vehicle on Park Road. 11:22 p.m. Coyote Group, South Canyon. I wrote these down because the act of writing them kept me in the practice of observation rather than anticipation. I was measuring. I was working. At 2:11 a.m., the sound stopped. Same character, same totality. One moment the thin November soundscape was there, and the next it was gone. Anasalta, replaced by that absolute, suffocating silence that my body now recognized before my mind did. My hands went to the armrests, my breathing shallowed. I looked at my watch. I wrote 2:11, dropout, in my notebook. And the scratch of the pen on paper was shockingly loud. This time, the silence lasted longer. I counted. I checked my watch. 4 minutes, 5, 6, 7, 8. At 8 minutes, I began to feel something I hadn't felt during the first event, a low, barely perceptible vibration in the rock under my feet. As if something very large were moving through the earth a long way below me. It wasn't seismic in any way I recognized. It was rhythmic, slow, irregular, but rhythmic, like breathing. At 9 minutes and 30 seconds, the singing began. It was louder this time. Not in volume, not in decibels. In presence. It occupied more of the space. It was more complex, more layered, and there was something in the harmonic structure that I hadn't heard before, a pattern that repeated. Not a melody, a phrase, a shaped unit of sound that occurred, paused, and occurred again with slight variation, like a sentence being spoken in a language that used pitch and interval instead of consonants and vowels. And this time, it was closer. I couldn't tell you how I knew that the canyon's acoustics would make distance estimation unreliable, even in controlled conditions, but I knew. The same way you know when someone is standing behind you in a quiet room. Not from sound, from pressure, from the displacement of something you can't name. I gripped my chair. The warmth was there, that terrible, welcome warmth. The feeling of being recognized, of being addressed. It was stronger than before. It was specific. The first time, at the first overnight, the singing had felt general, ambient, like weather. This time, it felt directional. It felt like it was singing to someone. And the someone was sitting in a camp chair on a mesa shelf in the dark. I was aware, in a very clear and calm way, that I wanted to respond. Not by singing, I'm not a singer. And the frequencies involved were beyond any sound I could produce with my voice. But by moving. By standing up and walking to the canyon rim, which was 40 meters away, and looking over the edge into the drainage, which was 600 feet below, and being closer to the source of the sound. The desire was not frantic. It was gentle. It was an invitation. It felt like the most natural thing in the world. The way going home at the end of a long day feels natural. The way putting down something heavy feels natural. Erin's voice was in my head again. But this time, it was quieter, and the singing was not. I did not stand up, but I understood in that moment that the margin was thinner than it had been 3 weeks earlier, and that if I came back, it would be thinner still. The singing lasted 2 minutes and 19 seconds. Longer again. The final tones lingered in the rock. I could feel them through the aluminum legs of my chair after they had faded from audibility. And then the insects resumed. A coyote called. And the canyon was a canyon again. I sat until dawn. I did not wake Naya. I did not sleep. In the morning, packing up, Naya said something that stopped me. She said, "I had the strangest dream last night. I was standing at the edge of the mesa, and the canyon was full of light. Not sunlight. More like the light was coming from the rock itself. And there was music. Not music exactly. More like the rock was resonating, vibrating at a frequency that was also a sound, that was also a feeling. And I knew that if I stepped off the edge, I wouldn't fall. I'd just become part of it." She said this casually, packing her equipment, not looking at me. The way you describe a dream that was vivid but that you've already filed under strange dream and moved on from. I said, "That is a strange dream." She said, "The weird thing is, it didn't feel like a dream. It felt like I was awake and just hearing something that was actually happening." Does that ever happen to you? Where a dream is so consistent with the environment you're sleeping in that you can't tell if you're dreaming or just perceiving something real with your eyes closed. I said that happened to everyone sometimes. We hiked out. In the car, I made a decision. I told Naya that I was going to recommend to her advisor that she use a different site for any further overnight recordings. I said that Station 27 had shown increasing equipment anomalies that might compromise her data quality, and that I wanted to ensure her dissertation was built on the most reliable data available. This was a lie. Her data from Station 27 was excellent. The equipment anomalies, whatever they were, had no effect on her ultrasonic bat recordings during active periods, but it was a plausible lie. And she was a graduate student who was in no position to challenge her NPS liaison's technical recommendation. She was disappointed. She asked questions. I gave her answers that were technically accurate and contextually misleading. She accepted the recommendation. We agreed on an alternative site, a canyon system 60 miles south with comparable bat diversity. And she scheduled her final overnight there for December. I should have stopped there. What I did instead was go back to Station 27 alone. December 3rd, I did not file a field plan. I did not tell anyone where I was going. I drove to the trailhead at 2 p.m., hiked in, and set up a single tent on the mesa shelf. I brought supplementary recording equipment, a portable, high-sensitivity microphone with a broader frequency range than the station's fixed unit, connected to a laptop running real-time spectrographic analysis software. I wanted to capture the event, if it occurred, with better equipment and in real time. I wanted to see the spectrogram as the sound was happening, to correlate my subjective experience with the objective data. That's what I told myself. That was the story I constructed. And it was partly true. I am a scientist, and the impulse to measure is real and legitimate. But the fuller truth is that I wanted to hear the singing again. I wanted to sit in the dark on that mesa and feel the canyon go silent, and then feel the warmth of that sound fill the space around me. And I wanted this with a specificity and an intensity that I recognized, even then, as a problem. The December desert was cold. Low 20s by midnight, clear, no wind. The soundscape was sparse, a few insects, an owl, the geological hum. I sat in my chair with the laptop open, the spectrogram scrolling in real time, a green-white river of ambient data flowing left to right across the screen. I watched it the way you watch a road at night attentive, patient, waiting for the headlights. At 2:33 a.m., the spectrogram went dark. I watched it happen on the screen. The ambient texture, the low-frequency hum, the sparse insect activity, the thermal noise collapsed across all frequencies simultaneously, like a curtain falling. Within 2 seconds, the only signal was the equipment's own noise floor. The display was black from edge to edge, scrolling in real time through perfect, total nothing. And outside my headphones around me, the world was silent. I started a timer on my watch. I watched the spectrogram. I breathed. I waited. At 6 minutes, the vibration began in the rock. I felt it through my boots. My spectrogram showed nothing. The vibration was below the frequency response of even my supplementary microphone. But I could feel it, slow, rhythmic, closer than before. At 8 minutes, the singing started, and my spectrogram lit up like a sunrise. I watched the data, and I heard the sound, and they were the same thing. And seeing it confirmed, seeing the harmonic structure appear in real time on the display. Exactly matching what my ears and body were experiencing produced a clarity that I had not anticipated. The singing was real. It was physically present. It was measurable, structured, and external to me. It was not a hallucination or a psychological artifact or an equipment malfunction. Something in that canyon was producing a complex, harmonically rich, structured tonal output in the dead of night. And it had been doing so for at least 3 years. And it was getting louder and longer and more complex each time. I stared at the spectrogram. The harmonic series was extraordinary, 18 distinct overtones above the fundamental, spaced at intervals that were close to, but not exactly, the natural harmonic series. The deviations were consistent and specific. If this were a musical instrument, you would say it was not tuned to any Western scale. If this were a voice, you would say it was not speaking any human language. But it was structured. It was organized. The phrase-like repetitions I had noticed in November were clearer now, and there were more of them. And they varied in ways that suggested I'm being very careful with this word, something like grammar. The warmth was there. The pull was there. But I was watching data, and the data was anchoring me. The spectrogram was a window between me and the sound, a layer of abstraction that let me observe without being fully immersed. I could feel the invitation, but I could also see it as a waveform. And seeing it as a waveform made it an object of study rather than an experience to surrender to. The singing lasted 3 minutes and 4 seconds. When it ended, I saved the file, closed the laptop, and sat in the cold until dawn. I had the best data anyone had ever captured of the phenomenon. I had high-resolution, broadband, real-time spectrographic analysis of a complete event. I had the silence, the onset, the full tonal element, the resumption of normal ambient sound. I had enough data to write a paper that would be the most significant contribution to acoustic ecology in decades. I drove back to Fort Collins, and I did not write the paper. I did not share the data. I put the files on an external hard drive, and I put the hard drive in a locked drawer in my home office, and I sat with the knowledge of what I had for 3 weeks without telling anyone. The reason I didn't share it is complicated, and I've had months to think about it. So I'll try to give you the honest version rather than the clean one. The clean version is that I didn't have enough data to support extraordinary claims, and that publishing prematurely would damage my credibility. That's true, but insufficient. The honest version has 3 parts. First, I was afraid that if I shared the data, other people would go to Station 27 at night. researchers, journalists, curious members of the public. People who would sit on that mesa and hear the singing and feel the pull. And I did not know what the pull was, or where it led, or what happened to a person who stopped gripping the armrests and stood up and walked to the canyon rim. I did not have evidence that anything bad would happen. But I also did not have evidence that anything bad wouldn't happen. And the 17, now 18 events in the record had been heard, as far as I knew, only by microphones and by me. No one had yet been drawn over that edge, and I was not willing to be the person who published the data that sent someone there. Second, I was afraid that if I shared the data, someone would explain it. A geologist would identify a subsurface phenomenon. An acoustician would model the canyon's resonance properties. A psychologist would explain the emotional response as infrasonic stimulation of the amygdala. And the explanation would be correct, probably. And the singing would become a known quantity, a solved puzzle, a paragraph in someone else's paper. And I did not want that. I did not want the singing to be explained. This is not a scientific impulse. I know that. I'm telling you anyway. Third, and this is the part I've had the hardest time admitting, I was not sure that sharing the data was what the singing wanted. I'm going to let that sentence stand without qualification, because qualifying it would be dishonest. I had begun to think of the phenomenon as having preferences. Not intelligence, I'm not claiming that, but orientation, directionality, the way a plant orients toward light without being intelligent, the way water finds the lowest path without wanting to. The singing was increasing in duration and complexity, and it was doing so in the direction of a single listener who kept returning to hear it. Whether that was responsive or coincidental, I could not determine. But I had started to feel, and feeling is exactly the wrong word for a scientist to use, and I'm using it anyway, that the relationship between the sound and the listener was not one-directional. In January, Erin Lacroix called me. She said she'd seen my service notes and noticed that Station 27 had logged 3 additional anomalous events since September. She asked how I was doing. Not professionally, personally. She asked it the way you ask someone how they're doing when you already suspect the answer. I told her I was fine. I told her the data was interesting, but that I was treating it as a low-priority equipment issue. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, Dan went out there at night, near the end. He didn't file plans. He went alone. He told me about it afterward. And the way he talked about it was the way you're talking about it now, calm, measured, professional, like he was describing data. But the data was the reason he went, and it was also the reason he couldn't stop going. He transferred to the Forest Service because I told him that if he didn't leave the circuit voluntarily, I would report the unauthorized field visits, and he'd lose his position. I want you to hear that. He didn't leave because he got a better offer. He left because I made him. I asked her what she thought the sound was. She said, I don't know. I never went at night. I never listened to the recordings more than once. I told Dan the same thing I told you, and Dan did the same thing you're doing, which is acknowledge the advice and then find a reason it doesn't apply. I asked her if Dan was okay. She said, he's alive. He works in Oregon now. He doesn't do acoustic monitoring anymore. He told me once that he can still hear it sometimes, at the edge of sleep, that it's quieter than it was, but it's there. He said it's like a song you heard once in a place you loved, and you can't find the recording, and you can't go back to the place. But the melody lives in your body, and it comes out when you're not guarding against it. She paused, and then she said, That's a beautiful way to describe something that I think is actually very dangerous. And the fact that it's beautiful is part of why it's dangerous. I thanked her. I told her I would think about what she said. She told me to think quickly. In February, Naya Rojas Kim contacted me. She had completed her alternative overnight recordings at the southern site and was writing up her results. Her bat diversity data from Station 27 remained the strongest in her dataset, and she wanted to include it in her dissertation. She asked if there were any data quality issues she should be aware of. I told her the data was clean. Then she said, "I've been meaning to ask you something. That dream I had at Station 27, the one about the canyon and the light and the sound. I've had it again, 3 times since November. Same dream, same place, same feeling. Is that normal? I mean, it's just a dream, but it's so specific, and it's always that place." I told her that vivid field experiences often recurred in dreams, and that it wasn't unusual. She said, "The thing is, in the dream, the sound has words. Not words exactly, but meaning. Like it's telling me something specific and I almost understand it. And if I could just hear it one more time in the actual place, not in the dream, I'd understand it completely." I heard myself telling her that was just how dreams worked. That the sense of almost understanding was a well-documented feature of dream phenomenology. That it didn't signify anything real. And I heard, underneath my own voice, the precise quality of a lie told by someone who knows the truth and is choosing to withhold it. Because Naya was describing exactly what I felt every time I listened to the recordings. The sense that the singing was nearly intelligible, that it was converging on meaning, that one more exposure, one more event, would be the one where the pattern resolved and the content became clear. I told her to focus on her dissertation. I told her Station 27 was off the table for further fieldwork. She accepted this. We hung up. In March, I drove the spring circuit. 13 stations, 9 days. At Station 27, I arrived at 10 a.m., serviced the equipment, pulled the card. On the card, I found 4 more events from January and February. 22 total now. The tonal elements were longer, more complex, and the harmonic structure had developed what I can only describe as a secondary voice. A lower, slower tonal line that moved independently of the primary melody. Sometimes in consonance, and sometimes in tension, creating a texture that was no longer singing, so much as it was conversation. I stood on the mesa shelf in the morning sun and looked out over the canyon, and I wanted to stay. Not the urgent, specific want of the nighttime pull, a broader thing, a quieter thing. The canyon was beautiful, and the air was clean, and the light on the sandstone was the color of honey. And I thought about setting up camp and sitting in my chair and waiting for dark. And hearing the singing again. Live in the open air. And this time, maybe this time, letting go of the armrests. I packed my equipment and hiked out and drove to Fort Collins and called Erin Lacroix and told her I was requesting reassignment from the Southwest Circuit. She didn't say anything for a few seconds. Then she said, "Good." I told my supervisor the reassignment was for personal reasons, which was true. He approved it without difficulty. The Southwest Circuit was transferred to a new technician, a recent hire named Marcus, whom I had never met. I briefed him on the logistics of the route. I told him about the road conditions, the access points, the battery issues at 3 of the stations. At Station 27, I told him to service the equipment during the day and to avoid staying past sunset. He asked why. I said it was a preference based on the remote location and the difficulty of the hike in the dark. He said, "Okay." I don't know if that was enough. I think about whether it was enough. I think about it often. That was 14 months ago. I work the Northern Rockies circuit now. The data is clean, the soundscapes are rich, and at 2 a.m. in the Montana backcountry, the world is loud with life. I process spectrograms and write reports, and the work is good. I still have the external hard drive in my locked drawer. I have not listened to it since February. Some nights, at the edge of sleep, I hear it anyway, a distant, warm, structured sound that is almost language, almost meaning, almost home. It fades when I open my eyes. It's quieter than it was, but it's there. Naya defended her dissertation in April. She emailed me a thank you note and a copy of the abstract. Her bat diversity data from Station 27 was the centerpiece of the analysis. She received her doctorate. In her email, she mentioned that she still dreamed about the canyon sometimes. She said it like it was a fond memory, a funny detail from fieldwork. She added a smiley face. I check Station 27's data logs remotely when the new cards are uploaded. Marcus has serviced it twice. His notes are brief, professional, unremarkable. In his most recent entry from April, he noted a single equipment anomaly, a signal dropout at 2:08 a.m., followed by a tonal artifact. He characterized it as probable microphone malfunction and recommended no action. He did not note anything unusual about the tonal element. He processed the data normally and moved on. This means either that he listened to it once and filed it away, the way Aaron told all of us to do, or that he processed the spectrogram without putting on headphones. I hope it's the second one. The most recent data pull from Station 27, which Marcus uploaded 2 weeks ago, contains 6 events from the last 3 months. 6 in 3 months. The frequency is increasing. The tonal elements are longer. The most recent one ran 4 minutes and 12 seconds. And there's something in the spectrograms that I haven't seen before. In the silence that precedes the singing, in what should be a completely empty band across all frequencies, there is a faint, almost imperceptible pattern in the noise floor. Not sound, not signal, but structure, a regularity in the electronic noise that shouldn't be there, that looks, when you zoom in on the spectrogram and adjust the color mapping, like a waveform that is too quiet to hear but too organized to be random. It looks like the singing is still happening during the silence, just below the threshold of the microphone, just below the threshold of hearing, waiting for the moment when it rises above both, and someone is there, and they are listening, and they want so badly to understand. I have not gone back to Station 27. I have not listened to the recordings. I have not called Marcus to warn him in any terms more specific than the ones I used, because I don't know what I would be warning him about. I have a locked drawer and a data set that could change the field and a memory of warmth that I did not earn and cannot return and do not want to lose. Naya emailed me last week. 1 line, no context. Have you ever considered going back? I haven't replied yet. I keep opening the draft and closing it. Not because I don't know the answer, but because I know 2 answers, and they are both true, and they cannot both be spoken at the same time. The canyon is still there. The station is still recording. The silence is still falling. And after the silence, something that sounds like singing is still rising out of the rock, longer each time, closer to meaning each time. And I am 800 miles away in Montana, and I can almost hear it from here. Almost. That's the word that keeps me up. Not the singing itself. The almost. The almost is the thing that has no floor.